Life Stories brings you tales of courage, love, and second chances. In today's story, an 8-year-old girl named Emily finds herself abandoned on a snowy highway. Her stepmother gone and the biting cold threatening to swallow her hope. But just as despair begins to set in, an unlikely hero appears, changing her life forever. This is a journey of resilience, healing, and the extraordinary power of kindness. Subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we begin today's heartfelt tale, where even in life's darkest storms, hope can light the way. Let's get started. Picture this: a little girl, just 8 years old, stands alone on a desolate, snow-covered highway in northern Colorado. The biting wind slices through her thin jacket, and the snow falls so heavily it begins to erase her small footprints. The world around her is cold, unforgiving, and vast, silent but for the relentless whistle of the storm. Emily's fingers are numb, clutching at her jacket as if the threadbare material could offer any real protection. She whispers into the growing darkness, her voice barely more than a breath. Someone will come soon. It's more a wish than a belief. But it's all she has left to hold on to. Only hours ago, Karen, her stepmother, had promised to return with help. They had pulled over on the side of the highway, Karen explaining that their car was having trouble. "Stay here," Karen had said. "I'll walk to get help. Don't move from this spot." Emily had obeyed, trusting Karen's words, as the afternoon sun shone brightly in the Colorado sky. But now, as darkness descended and the snow fell thicker, Emily began to understand the terrible truth: Karen wasn't coming back. Her small frame shivered uncontrollably as she pressed herself against the cold guardrail for some semblance of stability. Every time a vehicle passed, its headlights briefly illuminated her tiny figure before disappearing into the snowstorm. She had tried waving, but no one had seen her, the combination of the falling snow and growing darkness making her nearly invisible. Emily's legs ached from standing so long, but the icy ground was too wet and cold to sit. She thought back to earlier that day, when Karen had picked her up from school. Karen rarely handled school pickups, that was usually left to Mrs. Linda, their neighbor. But today had been different. "We're going on a little trip," Karen had said, her voice strangely sharp. "Your father called. We're meeting him." It hadn't made sense. Her father, Michael, wasn't due back from his business trip in Chicago for another 3 days. But Emily hadn't questioned it. She'd climbed into the car, clutching her backpack with her homework still inside, and stared out the window as the familiar sights of her small town gave way to endless fields and eventually towering mountains. Now, standing alone in the storm, Emily replayed the day's events, trying to make sense of them. Karen had been acting differently for weeks. Ever since she and Michael had argued, Emily had overheard fragments of the fight. "I never signed up for this. She reminds me too much of her." Karen's words had stung, even though Emily hadn't fully understood their weight. She knew Karen didn't like her much, but she hadn't thought Karen was capable of something this cruel. The wind picked up, stinging her exposed skin with icy flakes. Her school shoes, not designed for winter weather, were soaked through, and her toes felt like they were disappearing. Emily hugged herself tighter, trying to remember the warmth of her father's embrace, the sound of his laugh, or the way he always called her princess before bedtime. Her mind drifted to her mother, a memory that had grown faint over the years. Sometimes, Emily would sit in front of her mother's old vanity mirror, trying to find her face in her own reflection. But today, as snowflakes caught in her dark hair and her small body trembled against the storm, she felt further from her mother than ever. Just as the weight of despair began to press down on her like the accumulating snow, a voice cut through the howling wind. "Emily." She froze, unsure if she had imagined it. The storm had played tricks on her ears before, creating ghostly shapes in the snow and whispering sounds that weren't there. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Emily." Her heart leapt, a mix of hope and fear coursing through her. Was it someone here to save her, or something far worse? Her numb fingers waved weakly as she tried to call out. But her voice cracked, barely audible over the storm. She summoned all the strength she had left, her small body trembling as she cried out, "I'm here." Through the swirling snow, she saw the beam of a flashlight, cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. Emily waved again, this time catching the light. The voice grew closer, followed by the crunch of boots on the snow-covered ground. "Oh my God," a woman's voice exclaimed. Moments later, warmth enveloped Emily as strong arms wrapped around her. "You poor thing. You're freezing." The woman, who introduced herself as Linda, quickly shrugged off her heavy coat and wrapped it around Emily. She had been driving home when she thought she saw something near the guardrail. And despite the storm, she turned back to check. As Linda carried Emily to her old blue pickup truck idling on the shoulder, Emily's tears froze on her cheeks, mixing with the overwhelming relief that someone had come. The truck's cab was gloriously warm, and as Emily's numb hands reached out to the heater vents, she let out a shaky breath. For the first time in hours, she felt a flicker of safety, though the lingering fear of what had happened and what was yet to come remained heavy in her chest. Linda glanced at Emily, her kind eyes filled with worry. "We need to get you checked out by a doctor and call the police," she said softly. "But first, let's get you warmed up and fed." Emily nodded weakly, clutching Linda's coat tighter around her small body. As the storm continued to rage outside, Emily whispered to herself once more, though this time, it was no longer a plea but a quiet promise, "I'm safe now." Linda drove cautiously through the worsening snowstorm, her hands gripping the wheel. Emily sat huddled in the passenger seat, wrapped in the oversized coat, her body trembling as the warmth slowly returned to her frozen limbs. The truck's heater whirred softly, filling the silence with a comforting hum. Linda kept glancing at Emily, her heart aching for the girl. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" she asked gently. "Emily," the little girl whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold and her earlier sobs. "That's a lovely name," Linda said, offering a warm smile. "I'm Linda. We'll be home soon. And you can tell me everything." "Okay." Emily nodded. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the day. She thought of Karen's sharp tone when she picked her up from school, the long drive through unfamiliar roads, and the strange way Karen had avoided looking at her when she told her to stay by the guardrail. Emily had trusted her, as any child would trust an adult. Now, that trust felt shattered, leaving a deep, aching void in its place. Her voice quivered as she finally spoke. "She said she'd come back. She said she was getting help." Linda's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Who said that?" "Emily." Emily hesitated, her breath hitching as she whispered, "Karen, my stepmom." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. Linda didn't press her further, sensing that Emily needed time. Instead, she offered a reassuring nod and focused on getting them both to safety. When they arrived at Linda's cozy home, the warmth inside enveloped Emily like a soft embrace. The stone fireplace crackled with a cheerful fire, and the scent of cinnamon lingered in the air. Linda helped Emily out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in a thick blanket and settling her in front of the fire. "I'll make you some hot chocolate," Linda said, her voice as soothing as the warmth of the room. "Then we'll call the police and figure this all out." "Okay." Emily nodded silently, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. As the heat seeped into her frozen body, her thoughts drifted to her father. Where was he now? Did he know what had happened? Would he come for her? Her father, Michael, had always been her anchor. After her mother's death, it had been just the two of them for years, navigating life together. He would help her with her homework, make pancakes on Saturdays, and tell her bedtime stories when the nights felt too quiet. But everything had changed when Karen entered their lives. At first, Karen had seemed kind, always bringing small gifts and planning fun outings. But after the wedding, Her demeanor shifted. She became impatient, distant, and often left Emily feeling like an unwelcome guest in her own home. Emily had tried to win Karen's affection, but nothing seemed to work. Now, as Emily sipped the rich hot chocolate Linda had placed in her hands, she couldn't stop the tears from streaming down her cheeks. "Why did she leave me?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the question. Linda knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said softly, her eyes filled with compassion. "But I promise you, whatever happens, you're not alone anymore." Emily clung to those words, letting them settle into the cracks that fear and betrayal had left in her heart. For the first time since she was abandoned on the highway, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. A knock at the door broke the quiet moment, making both of them jump. Linda rose quickly, opening the door to reveal a tall man in uniform. It was Officer Paul Jenkins from the local police department, his face lined with concern as he stepped inside. "Linda," he greeted her, then turned his attention to Emily. "And you must be Emily. We've been looking for you." Emily stared at him, her small hands gripping the mug tightly. The sight of the officer brought a mix of relief and fear. "What would happen now?" "We need to ask you a few questions about what happened today," Officer Jenkins said, crouching to meet her at eye level. His tone was calm and steady, as if he understood how fragile the moment was. Linda sat beside Emily on the couch, her presence a steadying force. "You're safe now," she reminded Emily gently, taking a shaky breath. Emily began to recount the events of the day. As her voice wavered through the details, Karen's strange behavior, the drive into the mountains, the long hours waiting in the snow. Officer Jenkins listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When Emily finished, the room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Officer Jenkins exchanged a glance with Linda, his expression grim. "We'll do everything we can to find your father and figure out what's going on," he promised. Emily's voice trembled as she asked the question that had been haunting her since the storm began. "Do you think my dad knows I'm missing?" Officer Jenkins hesitated, then said gently, "We're working on reaching him, Emily. But right now, the most important thing is that you're safe." Linda placed a comforting arm around Emily's shoulders. "And you'll stay safe here with me," she said firmly. As Emily leaned into Linda's warmth, she felt a flicker of reassurance. Though her world had been turned upside down, she realized that perhaps she wasn't entirely lost after all. As Emily settled into the warmth of Linda's home, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was safe for now, but questions loomed like shadows around her. Where was her father? Why had Karen abandoned her? And, most pressing of all, what would happen next? Officer Jenkins had stayed late into the evening, coordinating efforts to locate Michael and understand Karen's actions. He made phone calls, his voice low but firm, and periodically updated Linda with grim expressions that betrayed the seriousness of the situation. Emily, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, clung to her hot chocolate like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. "Emily," Jenkins said gently, sitting down across from her, "do you know where your dad was staying in Chicago? A hotel?" "Maybe." Emily shook her head. "He didn't tell me. He usually calls when he gets there." Her voice wavered, and she added, "But he hasn't called yet." Jenkins exchanged a glance with Linda. "We've tried reaching him, but so far, no luck. Don't worry, though, we're doing everything we can to find him." Emily nodded, but her small hands trembled. She wasn't sure if it was from the cold still lingering in her bones or the fear that gripped her heart. Linda noticed and leaned over, placing a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "We'll figure this out," Linda said, her voice steady and warm. "You're not alone in this, Emily." Later that night, after Emily had fallen into a fitful sleep on the couch, Officer Jenkins received a call that sent a ripple of urgency through the room. He stepped into the kitchen to take it, but his voice carried faintly through the house. Rental car found at Denver International, traces of blood in the trunk, possible connection to Michael Andrews. Linda's heart sank as she overheard. She turned to look at Emily. Her fragile form curled under the blanket. Her face peaceful in sleep. The weight of what the little girl had endured, and might still endure, settled heavily on Linda's shoulders. When Jenkins returned to the living room, his face was grim but determined. "We've located Michael's rental car," he explained quietly. "It was parked in long-term parking at the Denver airport. But the situation is complicated." Linda's expression darkened. "What do you mean?" "There are signs of a struggle," Jenkins admitted. "And traces of blood. We believe Karen, or Elizabeth, as her real name appears to be, was involved. We're coordinating with Chicago authorities and tracing her movements." Linda shook her head, her voice laced with disbelief. "What kind of person abandons a child in the snowstorm and then this?" Jenkins sighed. "We're still piecing it together. But so far, it looks like Karen, or Elizabeth Monroe, has a criminal history. She and her brother, Adam Monroe, have been linked to financial fraud and money laundering. It's possible they targeted Michael for his position in his company." As Jenkins spoke, Linda's thoughts swirled. Karen's cold demeanor, the strange tension in the Andrews home, everything began to make sense. Karen had married Michael not for love, but for access to his resources. The next morning, Emily awoke to the sound of hushed voices in the kitchen. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, the blanket slipping off her shoulders. Linda quickly noticed and brought her a warm plate of pancakes. "Good morning, sweetheart," Linda said with a gentle smile. "I hope you slept okay." Emily nodded, though the knots in her stomach made it hard to focus on food. "Did you find my dad?" Jenkins knelt beside her, his tone soft but firm. "We're working on it, Emily. I promise we're doing everything we can." Emily hesitated, her voice small. "Why would Karen do this? Why would she leave me like that?" Linda exchanged a glance with Jenkins before sitting beside Emily, taking her small hand in hers. "Sometimes, people do terrible things because they're hurting or because they're selfish," Linda said gently. "But it's never your fault. None of this is your fault, Emily." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as Linda's words sank in. For the first time since the nightmare began, she allowed herself to cry freely, the weight of her emotions pouring out. Jenkins gave them a moment before clearing his throat. "Emily, I need to ask you something important. Do you remember anything unusual Karen did before all this? Maybe something that could help us?" Emily sniffled and thought hard, her brow furrowing. She was on the phone a lot, late at night. And last week, she cleaned out the garage. She said she was organizing, but she threw away a lot of papers. Jenkins perked up. "Did you see what kind of papers?" Emily shook her head. "No, but one night, I saw her burning some in the fireplace. When I asked, she got really angry and told me to go to bed." Jenkins nodded, jotting down notes. "That's helpful, Emily. Thank you." As the day wore on, Linda kept Emily busy, helping her color and read books while Jenkins coordinated with other officers. The little house became a hub of activity as new leads came in and decisions were made. Emily didn't understand all the details, but she clung to the hope that her father would be found. Despite the fear that lingered, she began to feel the smallest glimmer of strength returning. "Hold on, Dad," she whispered to herself as she stared out the window at the snow. "I'll find you." The day dragged on with a blur of phone calls, police updates, and hushed conversations between Linda and Officer Jenkins. Emily tried to stay busy, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She sat by the window, staring out at the snow-covered yard, her thoughts filled with questions. Was her father okay? Would they find him in time? Why had Karen, or Elizabeth as she now knew her, done something so cruel? Linda noticed the worry etched on Emily's face and brought over a tray with a cup of warm tea and cookies. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said with a smile. You need to keep your strength up. Emily took the tea gratefully but didn't say much. She felt weighed down by the enormity of everything that had happened. That evening, Officer Jenkins walked in with an urgency that caught Linda's attention immediately. "We've got something," he said. His tone clipped but hopeful. Canadian authorities found a remote cabin about 2 hours outside Vancouver. It's registered to a shell corporation tied to Elizabeth's brother, Adam Monroe. Linda leaned forward. Her hands clasped tightly. "Do they think Michael is there?" Jenkins nodded. "We don't know for certain. But it's our best lead yet. They've mobilized a team to check it out. But the area is remote. And the weather is making travel difficult." Emily had been listening from the doorway, her small frame barely visible in the dim light. "They'll find him, won't they?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. Jenkins softened his tone and crouched down to her level. "We're doing everything we can, Emily. The team is on their way now. And we'll get him back to you." The hours that followed were a tense waiting game. Linda kept Emily close, distracting her with stories and simple games. But it was clear the little girl's mind was elsewhere. Even Linda struggled to maintain her composure, her worry for Michael mixing with her anger toward Elizabeth. Finally, just past midnight, Jenkins received a call. His face lit up with a flicker of relief as he listened, then nodded. "Thank you. Keep me updated." He turned to Linda and Emily, who were watching him expectantly. "They've found him," Jenkins said. "Michael is alive." Emily's breath caught, and tears filled her eyes. "Is he okay?" "He's stable," Jenkins reassured her. "He was found in the cabin, heavily sedated but otherwise unharmed. They've arrested Adam Monroe at the scene. And Elizabeth was detained earlier today at the Canadian border. She had your father's wallet and other belongings with her." Emily ran to Linda, wrapping her arms tightly around her waist as she sobbed. "They found him," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it more real. Linda knelt down and held her close, brushing the dark hair from Emily's tear-streaked face. "They did. Sweetheart. Your dad's safe now." The following morning, Emily and Linda were on their way to Spokane, where Michael had been airlifted to Sacred Heart Hospital. The journey through the snow-covered landscape felt surreal, a quiet contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside Emily. When they arrived at the hospital, a kind social worker met them in the lobby. "Your father is awake," she said gently. "He's been asking for you." Emily's heart pounded as they stepped into the elevator and ascended to the 4th floor. When the doors opened, she saw him through the window of his hospital room. Michael looked pale and tired, with an 4 in his arm and monitors beeping softly around him. But when his eyes met hers, they lit up with a mixture of relief and joy. "Emily," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion as she ran into his arms. Despite the tubes and wires, he held her tightly, his hands trembling as he stroked her hair. "I missed you so much." Emily sobbed into his shoulder. "I missed you too, Princess." Michael murmured, "I'm so sorry. I should have seen this coming. I should have protected you." Emily pulled back just enough to look at him, her honey-brown eyes filled with determination. "It's not your fault, Dad. None of this is your fault." Linda stood quietly in the corner, wiping a tear from her cheek. She watched the reunion with a mix of relief and admiration for Emily's resilience. Officer Jenkins arrived shortly after to give Michael an update. "Elizabeth and Adam are both in custody," he explained. "The evidence against them is overwhelming: attempted murder, kidnapping, fraud, money laundering. They'll be facing serious prison time." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "And Emily? She's safe," Jenkins said firmly, glancing at Linda. "She's been in good hands." Linda smiled gently, her eyes meeting Michael's. "She's been incredibly brave. You both have." As Michael held his daughter close, he whispered, "We'll get through this, Emily. Together." Emily nodded, her small hand clutching his. For the first time in days, She felt a glimmer of hope. They had been through a storm, but they had found their way back to each other. The days following Michael's rescue were a whirlwind of activity. Doctors worked to help him recover from the sedatives he'd been given, and detectives pieced together the complex web of crimes committed by Elizabeth and Adam Monroe. While the legal processes churned forward, Emily found herself adjusting to a new kind of normal, a life filled with both challenges and surprising moments of comfort. Linda's small, cozy home became a sanctuary for Emily, who was reluctant to leave her father's side but found herself warming to Linda's nurturing presence. Mornings were spent at the hospital, where Michael gradually regained his strength, and afternoons were filled with quiet activities at Linda's. Emily would sit by the fire with a book or help Linda in the kitchen, finding solace in the routine. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, Emily curled up on the couch with Linda, her small frame enveloped in one of Linda's knitted blankets. The fire crackled softly as Emily hesitated before asking, "Do you think my dad will ever be okay again?" Linda looked at her with gentle eyes. "I think your dad is one of the strongest people I've ever met," she said. "He's been through so much. And he's still here, fighting for you. It'll take time, but with love and support, he'll heal. And so will you." Emily nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. "It feels like everything is broken," she whispered. "Sometimes it does," Linda said, her voice steady. "But broken things can be mended. And sometimes, when we mend them, they're even stronger than before." That night, Emily fell asleep with Linda's words echoing in her mind. She dreamed of her father, not as the pale, tired man she'd seen in the hospital, but as the strong, smiling dad she remembered from before. The following week, Michael was discharged from the hospital. Though his recovery was far from complete, he moved into a small, temporary apartment nearby, determined to stay close to Emily while he regained his strength. Linda stepped in to help with everything from meals to emotional support, quickly becoming an anchor in both their lives. One snowy afternoon, as they sat together in Linda's kitchen, Michael brought up the idea of starting fresh. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze moving between Emily and Linda. "Maybe it's time for a change. A new place. A new beginning." Emily's eyes widened with a mix of apprehension and hope. "You mean we'd move?" Michael nodded. "Not far. I want us to stay close to Linda if she doesn't mind having us around," he added with a small smile. Linda laughed softly, her cheeks flushing. "I think I'd miss you both too much if you moved far away." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. The idea of staying close to Linda bringing a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. Within weeks, they found a modest house just a few minutes from Linda's. It wasn't grand, but it felt right, a place where they could rebuild their lives. Emily spent hours helping Michael and Linda decorate her room, choosing bright, cheerful colors and hanging up drawings she'd made during her time at Linda's. "Do you think Mom would like this house?" Emily asked one evening as they hung up a set of wind chimes Linda had helped her make. Michael paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. "I think she'd love it," he said softly. "And I think she'd be proud of you. Emily, you've been so brave through all of this." Emily smiled, the weight of her mother's memory feeling less like a burden and more like a guiding light. As winter turned to spring, their new life began to take shape. Weekends were filled with simple joys, planting flowers in the garden, baking cookies in Linda's warm kitchen, and exploring the quiet streets of their new neighborhood. Emily even started to make friends at her new school, her laughter slowly returning as the scars of the past began to heal. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Michael turned to Linda and said, "I don't know what we would have done without you. You've been more than a friend, you've been family." Linda smiled, her eyes misty. "Family isn't always about blood," she said. "It's about the people who show up for you when you need them most." Emily listened quietly, her heart full. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever, peace. As the weeks turned into months, the shadows of the storm that had nearly taken everything from Emily and Michael began to fade. Life wasn't perfect, there were still difficult days. Moments when the memories of that snowy night or the betrayal by Elizabeth crept back in, but those moments were outweighed by the warmth of their new life. Linda's home remained a central part of their routine, and Emily had started calling it her second house. It was where she went after school to do her homework, where she learned to bake cookies, and where Linda taught her how to knit. Emily's first project, a scarf in uneven rows of bright blue and purple yarn, was far from perfect, but Linda praised it as if it were a masterpiece. "Every stitch tells a story," Linda said one afternoon, helping Emily correct a knot she'd made. "Even the mistakes make it unique. Just like life." Emily smiled, taking Linda's words to heart. She had come to see Linda as more than a kind woman who had rescued her that fateful night. Linda had become a constant in her life, a source of love and wisdom that helped her navigate the complexities of healing. Michael, too, was finding his way, though he still walked with a slight limp. The cane he had once relied on had been discarded. He had started working again, taking a position in the Spokane office of his company, which allowed him to stay close to Emily. Therapy sessions with a kind and patient counselor helped him unpack the guilt he carried for not recognizing Elizabeth's deception sooner. Slowly, he began to forgive himself. One spring evening, as the three of them sat around Linda's kitchen table, sharing a dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables, Michael cleared his throat. His nervousness caught Emily's attention. "I wanted to talk to both of you about something," Michael began, his eyes flicking to Linda. "This past year has been one of the hardest of my life. But it's also been a time of realizing what really matters." Linda smiled gently but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "Linda," he said, his voice softening, "you didn't just save Emily that night. You saved me, too. You've become such an important part of our lives. And I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me. Just the two of us." Emily's eyes widened as a grin spread across her face. She looked from her father to Linda, who was blushing, her eyes sparkling with emotion. "I thought you'd never ask," Linda said softly, her smile warm and full of affection. Emily couldn't help but giggle. "Finally," she said, drawing a laugh from both adults. From that night on, the bond between Michael and Linda deepened. They began spending even more time together, not just as a trio with Emily but as two people tentatively exploring the possibility of love. Emily watched their relationship grow with a mixture of joy and hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, her family felt whole again, different from before, but whole in its own beautiful way. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Elizabeth and Adam Monroe came to a close. Both pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including attempted murder, fraud, and kidnapping. Their sentences ensured they would spend decades in prison. For Emily and Michael, the conclusion of the case was both a relief and a painful reminder of what they had endured. But they didn't let the past define them. Instead, they focused on building a future filled with love, resilience, and the small joys that made life worth living. One summer afternoon, Emily sat on the porch swing of their new house, finishing the last rows of a second scarf she'd been knitting. Linda sat beside her, their shoulders touching as they rocked gently back and forth. "It's done," Emily said, holding up the scarf for inspection. Linda examined it with exaggerated seriousness, then broke into a wide smile. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Perfect timing. Too, you'll need it when school starts again." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She had come a long way since that snowy night when she had felt so small and powerless. Now, she was stronger, surrounded by people who loved her. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Michael made an announcement that filled the room with joy. He and Linda were officially dating. And though they were taking things slowly, their shared love for Emily and their growing bond promised a bright future. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Emily looked around the table and felt something she hadn't in a long time: complete and utter peace. The storm that had nearly destroyed her family had, in its own strange way, brought them closer together. It had given them a chance to start over, to find new meaning in love and life. Outside, the summer breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and the faint laughter of neighborhood children echoed through the air. Emily thought about everything she had been through, the people who had helped her, and the family she now had. "I love you, Dad," she said, leaning against Michael's shoulder. "I love you too, Princess," Michael replied, kissing the top of her head, more than all the stars in the sky. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who meant the most to her, Emily knew that no matter what storms might come in the future, she would never face them alone. As Emily sat on the porch swing, the warm summer breeze gently rustling her hair, she reflected on how far they had come, from the darkness of that stormy night to the warmth of this new life. Her family had endured and grown stronger. Michael and Linda's laughter carried from the kitchen, a reminder that love and resilience had rebuilt what was once broken. Emily smiled, her heart full of gratitude for the family she had gained and the peace she now felt. Sometimes, life's storms bring us to exactly where we need to be. Thank you for watching this heartwarming journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of love, resilience, and second chances. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that touch the heart. See you in the next video.